So I'm going to get this started. Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. This week it's moderated by Batya Weinbaum. And so welcome everybody who's here, and over to you, Batya and group.
Hi, good morning. It's 5 in the morning here in the States, and welcome to all who are watching this webinar on Shulamith Firestone's Dialectics of Sex. We're going to be discussing a classic in radical feminist theory that was written in 1969 and published in 1970. We all read this as a series of 3 different study groups that were going on at the same time, from being read by women from all over the world in the year 2021. And it was quite an experience to be reading this book that was written by a radical feminist American theorist during the second wave, which is really a very crucial book launching the second wave. And we experienced a lot of differences among women from all over the world when we were reading the book. And we took a literary text-based approach. We read the whole book, and we discovered that there was a benefit to reading a whole book and not just an excerpt of the book, because she's remembered for one basic idea. But we discovered that she discussed love, she discussed sexuality, she discussed pimps, she discussed prostitution, she discussed many ideas that are attributed to later radical feminists and later feminists that wrote after her. And we discovered that she had a very wry, humorous tone. And for example, when she wrote about children, she wrote that they didn't need to be protected with labor legislation to be protected about going down into the mines, because why should anybody be going down into mines after all? And she might be remembered for being crucially cruel in her non-protective attitude towards children, but her approach was society should not be oppressive at all, not that children needed special protection within that society. And we also discovered that there was a benefit of reading in groups, because people had different perspectives on the same text, and we could support each other while we read. And we took the approach of reading. Everybody brought each session, weekly or bi-weekly, what we liked about the book, what we disliked about the book, what we found was relevant for today, and questions that we had. And so we all appreciated her sarcastic, funny style. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who's going to talk more about the process. And Kate, take it away.
Thanks,
feminist from Australia.
Thank you. I want to just give some background to how I came to be here tonight. I got in touch with WHRC after the Militant Firestone Feminist Perspectives with Sheila and Batya in mid-July this year. Batya kindly offered to hold a study group on Firestone, and thank you, Batya, for your generosity, and for WHRC for facilitating the connection. Batya has held a number of study groups, which I'm sure have been of great benefit to women, and I hope tonight's webinar will serve as a study aid for any others reading this book. I found the method that Batya mentioned earlier to be really useful for focusing my reading and structuring the group discussions. As Batya mentioned, she instructed us to find a paragraph we liked, something we didn't like, and a question about from the chapter, and what we found relevant. In preparation for tonight's webinar, one theme we discussed was the importance of reading books cover to cover in groups with regular meetups and using a method like the one we adopted. I felt this was an important point to highlight. I struggled during my academic career with a somewhat fragmented style of learning. I wasn't really given much opportunity to read in-depth entire books apart from doing it on my own, and mostly extracts from books we used during my sociology degree. I was frustrated in my ability to become well-versed in works of key theorists, and I think this impacted my ability as a writer. And also feminist theorists like Firestone were never mentioned in my studies. And I didn't notice it. Batya has told me how vital study groups were for her as a young scholar in New York in the late 70s. I realized from her stories that this was absent for me, and I'm very passionate about generating more groups such as the ones we've undertaken. I've realized that I learn much better when I'm in groups, particularly groups that are women focused, reserved for women. Batya is also committed to reading entire books. She said that when you read a writer from beginning, middle to end, wrestling with an idea or concept, it is an entirely different experience from just getting a slice or morsel. Wrestling with Firestone, I think, has helped me as a writer, provide me with greater confidence to wrestle with my own ideas. I just want to ask if anyone else wanted to say anything about the importance of the group process or the importance of reading books in their entirety, or we can move on.
I just wanted to say I think it's really valuable to hear what other women think of a book as well, because obviously you can read it yourself, you'll come to your own views, but hearing what other women think provides additional sort of depth and insight. So I think I found that really the group process was very important for me.
Especially when you come to something you don't like about a book, you can just on your own put it down. And when somebody else doesn't like something about a book, you can criticize a book without rejecting it and putting it down completely, and put a concept in context. We did a lot of contextualization while we were reading.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Kate. Now we're going to go on to Dorothea Annison, who's from the UK, and she's been a feminist for 40 years. She's delighted to be rediscovering feminist classics with women of all ages from around the world. Dorothea will share her analysis of Firestone's views on sexuality in the family and her utopian thinking, and discuss how the book is relevant now. Take it away.
Thank you. So the key points of Firestone's views on the oppression of women is that she sees reproduction, sexuality, and the family as the root causes of women's oppression. So the key thing for her is that women become pregnant and care for children. This leads to the division of labour between men and women and creates biologically based sex classes, men take advantage of women's dependency to take control. This leads to the creation of families that privatise women. They keep them dependent on men and stop them playing a full role in society. They become economically dependent. So the relationship of mothers and children in a nuclear family for Firestone is the basis of psychosexual development and key to the development of differences in male and female psychology. She bases her model on the work of Freud. She feels that he asks the right questions but gets the wrong answers. And this is because he neglects what for her is the crucial aspect, which is male power. So she sees that all children start by identifying with their nurturing and loving mother, but they realise that fathers have greater power and offer access to the world of work and activity outside the home. So they have to shift their identification to a father who is often stern, remote, and bullying. For boys, this has the rejection of women's love and the repression of their emotions when they're told to toughen up and be a man. Has negative effects like the separation of sex from emotions, the confusion of sex and power, and a focus on genital sexuality to the exclusion of other bodily pleasures, and leads them to degrade and despise women and our sexuality. Girls realise that boys are allowed greater freedom and opportunities to be active and adventurous, while she and her mother are restricted to maternity and domesticity. So this can lead to hostility or resentment towards the mother. Firestone sees the girl as having two options at this point: to adopt feminine behaviours, so-called, to win male approval, passivity, submissiveness, seductiveness, or to become a tomboy, to start to copy the behaviour that gets boys' approval from parents, teachers, etc. But of course, she finds that this won't work after puberty, when she starts to be seen as a sexual being. And this is something that can still have a very negative impact on young women growing up. So the result of these family processes is the masculine and feminine roles and stereotypes, especially male aggressiveness and female passivity, and the creation of a male sexuality that can be harmful to women. She's very clear that it's not the penis that the girl envies. Firestone can see no reason why that organ should be seen as superior. It's just a metaphor for her envy of the male power of fathers and brothers and their opportunities in the world that she feels excluded from. So Firestone says that the abolition of the patriarchal family is essential to achieve women's liberation. She doesn't see sex roles, or what would now be called gender, or sexuality as innate. They're a product of the male power in the family. And as they're socially constructed, they can be changed. So she sees the end of the family leading to the end of masculinity and femininity. In modern terms, she's a gender abolitionist. So I want to move on to one of the things I found really valuable in her book, which is her final chapter, which sets out a vision for the future society, sort of after we've got rid of patriarchy. And I think it's very important to have visions to inspire change and revolution. An analysis of what's wrong with patriarchy without positive suggestions for change can lead to fatalism. I think it's better to put up a vision to be criticised, and there's certainly flaws in hers, and improved than not have one at all. So to just run through what the key aspects of her future society are, she draws on Marxist ideas of change via technological and economic transformation. She predicts the widespread use of automation, computers, robots, and that will lead to an end of wage labour and domestic labour for women, because the automation will produce enough to meet all needs. She also suggests that this would include the use of artificial reproduction, which has been very controversial. She describes this as women seizing control of the means of reproduction. And this would free women from the burden of pregnancy, which she describes as barbaric, and so free us from dependency and control by men. This would mean that the family as an economic unit is no longer needed, and the end of family would lead to the end of sex roles and transition to a different psychology. So the end of sex roles and prescribed behaviours for women and men would mean that sex wouldn't matter anymore, culturally or economically. It would be the end of the psychological behaviours of masculinity and femininity. This would leave people free to form different types of relationships and households. Single people might live just devoted to fulfilling creative pursuits. Some couples would live together without any need for marriage or state involvement, or there could be larger households involving a number of adults rearing children. The relationships can be lesbian, gay, straight, whatever, there's complete freedom. The household would not just be biological relatives of the children, and it would share care amongst all adults, not just mothers. And all these relationships would be based on love and mutual consent, and that would include the children. She suggests that there could be some sort of divorce process if they didn't like the household they were in. There are weaknesses in her work. I mean, after the proposals for artificial reproduction do reflect a very negative view of pregnancy and birth. She describes birth as barbaric, as like shitting a pumpkin. And many women who have actually given birth, of course, have very different views and very positive experience of motherhood. But at the time, I think it was important to say that women don't have to be mothers and that it is hard work. She's also got some problematic views about children and about sexuality. She sees a future without sexual repression, that the end of the family could mean the end of the incest taboo and the ability to have relationships regardless of sex or age. That's wrong, naive, and misunderstands childhood sexual development. She's very keen to liberate children as well as adults, and has a whole chapter on liberation of children, but she's mistaken in seeing them as small adults and neglects power relationships. I think in this she's very influenced by some popular theorists of the time, like Reich and Marcuse, who clearly linked sexual and political repression. That was very much in the air of the radical movements of the 60s, and that you couldn't end one without the other. So thinking about what's relevant today and why we should still read Firestone, I think it's very important that she asks big and bold questions. She challenges everything, nothing's out of bounds, you know, sex, childhood, motherhood, everything. And she wants a complete change. She doesn't think we can reform the current society and benefit women. You know, it needs a complete change. And I think it's one of the first sort of statings of some key feminist principles, which are women are a class oppressed because of our sex. Men want to control our bodies for sex and children. And it's the role of mothers that can lead to economic dependency. Sex roles, which are now often defined as an innate gender identity, are not natural or inevitable or fixed. They're behaviours and attitudes that result from a childhood in a patriarchal family. Femininity is a result of the oppression of women, not its cause, and it won't be needed or relevant in the future. She has an essentially androgynous vision, which doesn't appeal to all women, because many women want to sort of preserve a distinctively women's culture. But I think her vision can, or, you know, does offer positive sort of suggestions for straight women and their future. So she's very clear liberation won't be achieved in our current society. We need to overthrow the family and capitalism and change our psychology. I also think the weaknesses in her work shouldn't mean rejecting her totally. We need to take what's valuable to us and use it. We need to build on the work of second wave feminists. The women of the second wave identified how earlier feminist work was silenced and lost, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen again by building on their insights to develop our own theory and activism.
Wonderful. Round of applause. Okay, next we're going to hear from our radical feminist sister from India, who's interested in studying feminist theory with regard to its relevance for women in developing countries. She will focus on Firestone's views on love and romance.
Hello, thank you, Batya. Hello, everyone. In her chapters on love and romance, Firestone says that literature and metaphysics have only recreated love. They have not analyzed it. She says that love has political significance because of the panic and the backlash that follow any attempts to analyze it. She also says that women and love are the underpinnings of culture. Analyzing them is a threat to culture itself. I find it relevant to quote her here when she says that women live for love and men live for work is a truism. Shuli also says that male culture is parasitical, feeding on the emotional strength of women without reciprocity. Patriarchy is unilateral. There is no reciprocity in marriage or in heterosexuality. Firestone says that love itself is not bad. It is the process of falling in love which happens in a context of inequality between the sexes. Her rather famous quote, "Love is essentially a much simpler phenomenon. It becomes complicated, corrupted, or obstructed by an unequal balance of power." In these chapters on love and romance, she traces the process of falling in love back to her own interpretation of the Oedipal complex. The rejection of the boy by the mother leads him to spend the rest of his life trying to find a substitute of the mother in other women. But fearing rejection, he is unable to commit and reciprocate. However, this is where I would like to differ from her. It is because she does not explain why the same does not happen to girls who are also rejected by the mother in their early years of life. I am of the view that men's incapability to reciprocate, commit, and to truly love women stems from male supremacy and its institutionalized dehumanization of women. Men, as the oppressor class, are not expected to and do not need to reciprocate or commit to women. Shuli says that under male supremacy, women need to be loved by men in order to survive, socially and economically. I find this point relevant for women and girls in my country, where most women of all socioeconomic strata enter into arranged marriages. So in the unique context of India, one can substitute love to mean being in a conjugal relationship. Marriage, whether arranged or love, is still the obvious for women in India, whether they are poor or they are rich. Firestone is right in saying that women who decide not to fall for men soon find out that it is either marry or nothing. So it is noteworthy that not all of her arguments are isolated only to America or to the West, nor are they outdated. She criticizes the sexual revolution. She says that despite the so-called revolution, the situation of women has not changed. Women who resist men and love are called stuck-up, and it is the cool chick who is the desired standard. She says that the psychological dependence of women on men is created by the socio-economic oppression women face. But she also says that that socioeconomic oppression is no longer enough to maintain it. So she does take into account legal reforms and equal opportunities. Therefore, romanticism is added to keep reinforcing the idea that women love men and must love men and can only love men. She identifies 3 tools of romanticism. First being eroticism, that everything has erotic value. All human needs for love and warmth are only channeled into genital sex. So, for example, a frequent trope in romantic films and literature that men and women can never just be friends. The other is what she calls sex privatization, which means equating sexuality with the individuality of women, creating the false idea that women, due to a particular feature like blonde hair, are distinguishable from the rest. This false difference then informs the rhetoric of love. What it does is that it keeps women ignorant of their status as a class, with oppression on the basis of sex being the common among us. that despite these bogus features of uniqueness, we are all ultimately the same to them, subordinate, fuckable, and dispensable. The third tool Disha identifies is beauty ideals. She tears beauty ideals apart in this chapter. She says that the very purpose of an ideal is its rarity. It would not be an ideal if it were common. So women are subjected to these illogical, made-up standards of beauty and desirability. She says that beauty serves the political purpose of pouring women's energies into achieving these standards, made by makeup or diet or clothes. She argues that the contradiction between sex privatization and beauty ideals leads to a lot of mental distress in women. Because it is because we are constantly expected to stand out and yet have to conform to the laid out standard of desirability. Firestone says that when love takes place in a power context, everyone's love life must be effective because power and love don't make it together. Her book is a fine example of the phrase, the personal is political. She has politicized love. It is not that modern day feminists, especially in India, do not talk about the love dynamics. However, the personal is political has been given a postmodernistic interpretation. It now means analyzing individual or micro narratives without being able to or allowed to draw any general conclusions from them about the situation of women. Whereas the personal is political was originally meant to argue that systems and practices like marriage and love, which are considered to be personal, must be subjected to a systemic analysis to inquire into the condition of women. It is interesting that Firestone does not refer to lesbianism as an alternative to the dead end that falling in love with men is. Furthermore, despite her radical analysis, Firestone does not argue for us to get rid of beauty and eroticism. She says that without eroticism, our lives would be dull and drab. What she opposes is the concentration of all human joy and excitement into the one narrow alley of genital sex. She leaves the theme with this compelling idea. However, I wish she had built on it a little more. Overall, I applaud her courage and her brutal honesty in taking on love in a radical and incisive manner. It is something that we need more of today in our feminist politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Good job. Okay, now we're moving on to Kate Williamson, who's a sociologist and radical feminist from Australia. She took the 10-week Firestone study group with all of us, and she participates in the ongoing Kate Millett study group. And she's going to discuss Firestone on male culture.
Thank you, Batya, and thank you, Dorothea and our Indian sister. They were great. I'll be discussing chapter 8, male culture. In this chapter, Firestone examines male domination and culture more closely. It integrates the themes that both Dorothea and our Indian sister have discussed, the privatization of the family and how love and romance entraps women. The chapter is entitled Male Culture, and the word male is bracketed for a reason. Firestone views women's representation in culture as disguising male power. You might think that women have power because, as Firestone says, women seem to be all that anyone ever thinks about. I suspect Firestone, I know Firestone, like many of us, questions culture because deep down we know that these somewhat artificial cultural representations don't gel with us. Firestone's radical feminist perspective looks at the root cause of the sex-based distortion in culture. Coming back to Dorothea's earlier discussion, there is a power relationship in the family, and this impacts emotional development. Women are conditioned to be submissive and to spend a great deal of energy on men. Men then exploit this energy to create cultural artifacts. Firestone says they do this because they are emotionally warped. They cannot live comfortably in the emotional space of the home and sublimate their own emotional drives in work outside the home. Women are the subject matter of art because men are inspired by them, but men do not understand women. Men do not understand how women's oppression shapes their lives, and it shows in their art, particularly how male authors write female characters. Firestone scrutinizes female impressionist painters and ponders whether their art is feminist, that is, contributing in any way to correct the sex bias. She says that female impressionist artists don't because they painted scenes deemed suitable for a female to paint, children and the home. I had some difficulty with this section of the chapter as I had trouble seeing the sex bias in Impressionism. I was only aware of the technical aspects of this art form. I thought that female impressionist painters might have been painting female subjects because this is what drew their attention. After discussing with Batya, I realized that Impressionism is an art movement led and controlled by men and therefore inherently sexist. I realized the point that Firestone was making is that it was the female art of this period was depoliticized, or this art form was depoliticized. She could have said more about how female artists were restricted in what they could paint to develop her argument a bit further. Firestone also makes a very important point that when women compete with men in culture, women must imitate male psychology, and in doing so lose a sense of their own authenticity, which makes them ill. She claims that this leads to narcissism in women. She is sympathetic to women who, as artists, attempt to deviate from male culture. She says that in doing so, they risk ostracism and fierce criticism. This unfair criticism stems from men's failure to tune in with the female experience rather than an accurate appraisal of women's art. Firestone, as a painter, likely experienced this disconnect herself. She studied painting at the School of Art in Chicago. In the documentary on Firestone, which is available on YouTube, there's a scene where there's a room full of men discussing her paintings. There is not a single female present. I like how she integrates her analysis with early childhood socialization. She includes a personal anecdote, which I found amusing. She observes how the comic book collections of her brother were gendered to appeal to boys, which she found dull. She makes this funny quip, and I quote, my brother thought girls' tastes were drippy, and I thought he was a crude slob. Who was right? We both were. But he won, he owned the library. So this links back to Dorothea's comment that Firestone was a gender abolitionist. Gendered art to her is bad art. What I take from this is that sex role stereotyping keeps people stuck in a semi-childlike state. Firestone says that men and women live different halves of reality. Firestone sees this as a problem as it distorts reality, and we therefore are not really living authentic lives. Male culture does not attempt in any real way to integrate the split. She applies the dialectical method to show how threats to male domination result in backlash. She refers to the new virility school of the 20th century of tough male writers like Hemingway trying to save their manhood, which was to her a backlash to the growing threat to male supremacy. Firestone also makes a provocative observation that the greater participation by minority groups to her spells art's decay rather than the revitalization of culture. I think what she is saying here is that when entry is granted to a minority group, it indicates a decline in the status of that art form. Germaine Greer has made a similar point regarding medicine. I recall her saying that since women became doctors, the status of medicine has declined. In conclusion, Firestone states that only a feminist revolution can eliminate entirely the sex schism. She says that until then, pure art is a delusion. She believes that female art that explores female reality authentically could birth a new consciousness, if aligned with a strong political movement. This could be a topic for another feminist perspectives, the feminists who have written about the role of authentic art in giving fuel to the feminist movement. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, that's one of my favorite chapters. I'm going to pick up some points here. One of my pet peeves about Firestone is that she's just remembered for her statements about technology, but in her different chapters about love and sexuality, she says love is the root of oppression. And in her chapter about sexuality, she says sexuality is the root of oppression. So she says different things at different times in the different chapters, yet she's just hit hard for one thing that she said in one of the chapters, which she's often quoted about. And one of the chapters that is not ever discussed anymore is the chapter on race. And I think it's because it's problematic. At the time when the book came out and I read it in the 70s, I totally missed that chapter myself. I think my life experience was different. The experience of the movement was different. One of the members in one of the groups pointed out that she had a very colonial construction of race, and that her analysis of race was based on Frantz Fanon, who is a French psychiatrist from the French colony of Martinique. And if you read The Wretched of the Earth, his psychological and psychiatric analysis of the dehumanizing effects of colonialism, which was published in 1961, is very much reflected in her analysis of race. But it was very non-dialectical. Most of the book is talking about historically, this is how things began, and now this is how things are, and hopefully things will swing to the future in a different direction or in a further direction from where they are. And in the race chapter, she leaves out history, so it's ahistorical. And also it's non-dialectical. There's no swinging to the future of how things might change in terms of racial relations. And also she's projecting from a lived experience in the movement to a large universal domain, which is a little off base. And she leaves out other dimensions of race beyond black and white, which is very limited. So you can say she's limited to her times, but there were also racial discriminations going on against, like, Jews. Her own father participated in the liberation of a concentration camp in Germany. So certainly she knew about that kind of racial discrimination. And the United States had just put Japanese in camps during World War II. So there were other, besides black and white, racial discriminations going on, which she didn't take into account at all. So that's a big gap, that chapter. And also she uses anecdotes to support huge generalizations. We noticed that throughout many sections of the book, but in this section of the book, it was particularly glaring. Like, she took a generalization from what a black male nationalist wrote about a black woman's exclamation of during sex, and made generalizations about black women's sexuality, and we thought that was pretty much off base. But I think that we concluded, or many of us thought, that she wrote at a time when we were all in a tunnel, and she was, one of the members of one of the groups said that she was like shining a light through a tunnel and getting out to the other side, and we're now out on the other side. So some of what she writes, like the technology, she writes about how women are estranged from technology, and she looks to technology for liberation, but not only in reproduction. And she looks at AI as potentially liberating the workforce. And yep, we decided to remember that at the time in which she wrote, women were largely typing on manual typewriters in offices. And so we have to remember the context in which she was writing when we talk about her work. But she also talked a lot about chivalry, her writing about, the children's liberation. She always tied children's liberation to women's liberation. So in many of her writings about children, she wasn't saying that we shouldn't have them. She was saying that their liberation was important to women's liberation, and she tends to be forgotten for that. So with that, I would like to turn everything over to what everybody else has to respond to each other. So I think everyone did a great job, and I would like to encourage the formation of more groups. And I think somebody was going to put in the chat an email that was created to help foster more groups. But take it away. Anybody have any response or questions?
I think it's interesting that, sort of hearing from our Indian sister, that she can see the value of the work in understanding and helping the situation of, women in the global South, women of colour, because one of the things that the second wave are most often criticised for is having a sort of, being white and middle class and yes, some of them were actually white and middle class. It doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't things that we can learn from them. They didn't totally neglect race, even though some of the ideas were flawed. They didn't sort of neglect class. And so I think, it's good that it can still be felt to be relevant by women around the world.
Yeah, I think I would second that, what Dorothea just said, because as a radical feminist from India, I look for precedents, I look for books, I look for sources that I could turn to, and I could show my sisters over here and tell them that here is a woman who has thought about these things, and this has been said before, that love is not essentially the great liberator that we are always told to see it as. So it's, from that, it's I need to retain Firestone because I need to refer to her in some situations, in some contexts. I need that precedent, and it's sort of emphasize that this has been said before, but women have said this so many decades before, and we're not, and we need to pay attention to these things. So I don't think she's anything, she's not outdated, she's not irrelevant, you know? Yeah, so that's absolutely true.
I think we discussed too how following the book as a whole, as a process, that we appreciated her courage of mind, and that there was some value that she wrote before the establishment of the field of women's studies, let alone the establishment of the field of gender studies, and that she was not afraid to think, and that she even incorporated into her writing at some point towards the end of the book that she knew that she was trying to project ideas about a world and she might be criticized for some of her ideas, because how could she think of the future being in the present that she was in? She said something like that, but she took the courage to try to project. She wasn't intimidated, and she was very brave, and she was a young woman. I think she was 25 when she wrote the book, and we talked about how her age impacted maybe her identity, impacted what she wrote, because of the context in which she wrote. We decided it affected her a lot. But the context of being free from the disciplines of the university that were disciplining her thought, and she would say things like the incest taboo, whereas, you know, Kate Millett would say only the breakdown of sexual inhibitions, and she wouldn't be explicit about which taboo she was talking about, and her language was more caged. And Shuli wasn't mincing her words, and we sort of admired her for that gutsiness in her extrapolations into the future. And one of them that she's forgotten about is she was really talking about a world in which we would have to work, we wouldn't have to work anymore, that we would have guaranteed income in a transition to a non-moneyed economy. So we forget how utopian she was in her thinking. And we thought also that it was kind of misogynist, the way that she was canonized and beaten up for one idea that was taken out of context in the way she's remembered. So Kate, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Someone's asked in the chat about her neglect of childhood vulnerability. I think that's the question. We talked about that a bit. We've talked about that a bit previously, where I think it seemed to be her intention that she wanted to sort of liberate children at their own agency rather than perceive them as vulnerable. I think that as having strength. Yeah,
she was trying to conceptualize a society in which there wasn't any oppression.
Yeah.
And then children were operating within that society. So it's very hard for us, when we know about how oppressed children are, to imagine children in a free society. So when we talk about the lack of protection of children, we're thinking that in our society. We're not thinking in a future society where liberation has already occurred.
Yeah, I think she was very optimistic, and she was very deeply committed to liberation in all its aspects. But I think that optimism, and maybe combined with her youth, because I think I was certainly more optimistic in my youth than I am now, and I've become more cynical with age, is that optimism it leads to naivety and leads to thinking that we can magically get rid of all power relations, and it will be more difficult than that. And you can get rid of power, you can potentially get rid of power relations between men and women. You can get rid of power relations based on racial difference, but children are always going to be weaker than adults. And I think that is a very good point, and I'm glad it was raised in the Q&A and in the chat, because that is a reality. That isn't an artificially created power distinction. That is an actual physical vulnerability that children, when they are young, rely on adults for care and nurture, and that must always be protected. And that does create a dependency and vulnerability. So even with adults that are maybe freed from some of the more obvious power relationships, it does mean that we need to have still a focus on children as, because of their unique vulnerability, being an absolute focus of care. And I think that thing, she does the liberation, but then, you know, what is a very important thing that many other feminists have raised is that we do need a focus on care, that however we transform society economically, some people are still going to need care, both at the start and often at the end of life. And if we don't have, you know, sort of a deep commitment to that care, then that is actually a weakness. And I think, yes, it is a blind spot, but then, you know, she wrote a book, she covers an enormous amount of things, but because she covers a lot of different topics, I think at times she can be a bit superficial in things, but that's because she's trying to do, you know, reproduction and sex and love and beauty and art and you know, within, you know, what is not a particularly thick book, you know, so there are weaknesses, but I think it gives us something. It's thought-provoking, and we can think and we can say, we can take this and we can reject that.
Yeah, we talked about Firestone's age too, and that she was young and perhaps not aware of her own vulnerability, maybe. I can't recall the conversation, but that might have had something to do with her.
Yeah, and she was trying to overcome her. She certainly suffered in her own childhood, which I went into in the other webinar more. So I don't think she was saying children as a class were not oppressed. She was very aware of that. And I was trying to find the quote where she called for children's liberation. And she did say women wouldn't be liberated until children were, at the conclusion of her Down with Childhood chapter. So, but she thought that the whole society was responsible for the liberation of children, not just the individual mothers.
I think there is something relevant to be found, you know, in each chapter. Because, like you said, it's difficult to pack so much a variety of these topics into just one book, and with her limitations of her experience and her age and the times that she was writing. But I think if you read the whole book, even if you don't agree with the entire book, there are these some things that you would still find compelling, and I would encourage the reader to, you know, to hold on to them and to, you know, try and build upon that, because that's what she's doing. She's touching upon variety of things, and she's sort of, you know, just she's giving a direction. You can, so that's why it's so thought provoking, you know. So I mean, when I read her chapter on love and romance, it gave me a lot of new perspective, you know. I mean, I knew that the love dynamics was wrought with inequality and violence, but it's sort of the way she's written it and the examples that she's given, I found them to enrich my own understanding. So
but here's what she actually says about children at the end of her Down with Childhood chapter. Except for the ego rewards involved in having children of one's own, few men show any interest in children, and fewer still grant them their due political importance. So it is up to feminist, ex-child, and still oppressed child women, revolutionaries, to do so. We must include the oppression of women of children. We must include the oppression of children in any program for feminist revolution, or we will be subject to the same failing of which we have so often accused men, of not having gone deep enough in our analysis, of having missed an important substratum of oppression merely because it didn't directly concern us. I know this, I say this knowing full well that many women are sick and tired of being lumped together with children, that they are no more in charge and responsibility than anyone else's will be an assumption crucial to our revolutionary demands. It is only that we have developed in our long period of related sufferings a certain compassion and understanding for them that there is no reason to lose now. So she's actually calling for women to be compassion for children, have compassion for children in our revolutionary demands. And this was a time when one of the revolutionary demands was universal childcare. And we used to set up childcare at conferences. And, you know, I was one of those people that went around and made women's studies have childcare so that, you know, women with children could come to childcare. And I was a pain in the neck at all these professional conferences I went to. But this was why, you know, so I think it's really misplaced when you actually read the book and you see that she's calling for women revolutionaries to take care of children, or else we're missing what's basic. If you read what she actually wrote, it's hard to fault her in the way that she's faulted by people who just read excerpts.
Yeah, exactly. That's great.
Yeah,
Great.
I mean, one of the things for me is I came to Firestone. I did read it when I was, quite young in my 20s. But what I'd read previously, the two books that sort of made me a feminist, the very first books I read were actually two novels that I went and bought the very first time I went into our city's radical bookshop when I was about sort of 18, with earnings from my Saturday job. And the two books I bought, one was Alice Walker's The Colour Purple. The other was Woman on the Edge of Time by Marge Piercy. And both of them had a great impact on me. But Marge Piercy's book is, it's a story of a Latina woman who's got, she's poor, she's got all sorts of sort of problems that she's facing in her life. She's been a victim of domestic abuse, she's had a child taken away, and she's been labelled as mentally ill. But she has, obviously the question is she time traveling? Is she hallucinating? But she encounters a future utopian society, which is very much, I didn't know at the time. It really impressed me, and it was like, yes, this is what I would like to see. And it was only later when I read The Dialectic of Sex that I realised it was very much drawn from Firestone's vision. It's kind of an imagining of how some of the ideas that Firestone sets out in her chapter, in her final chapter, could be actually played out in reality. And it's a book I've read it again over the years, and I've always found those things actually quite inspiring. And it's a future I wouldn't mind living in. So that's where I'm coming from with Firestone. Yes, it's flawed, but I think it does give us a basis for how we move into the future.
Another book that does that is The Female Man by Joanna Russ. There's a future society while away, in which the daughters are communal property, or they're not property, they're communally raised, they're running around free and so forth. And
someone's just put in the chat who's writing about women's utopias now. There was a much more of those types of book, back in the 70s and 80s. Not now, not that I'm aware of, and not as it's, I think we seem to have, and I can understand we've got so much, horrific things to focus on in the here and now, but where's our, where are we going to? Where, what are we aspiring to?
It doesn't really work that way. Talk about disillusioned utopians. I mean, I remember when I went out as a speaker in the 70s to the University of Michigan, and this woman came up to me, and, she was very upset that she'd had a child, and the women's studies place didn't really give her any support. And you have a child in the midst of this feeling that there's going to be utopian support of you and your child, and you find out you're really alone with your child, and the society doesn't support you in the way that you have these utopian ideas that they will. So, a lot of people had this generalized view that children were the responsibility of society when we had our children, and we were all surprised that that wasn't the case, or many of us were. So anyway, I wasn't following the chat. Kate, or is there more in the chat that we should be aware of?
Just a criticism that Firestone, they found that she lauded the conquering processes and deemed it as
lauded the what processes?
Conquering
of nature, I think was the comment, and a world of machines, Whereas obviously now we have the eco-feminist sort of movement is sort of quite rightly saying that we are part of nature. We have to work with nature, not attempt to conquer it. And I think is I think there is, it's just possibly got, it's another aspect of a naivety that not thinking about the negative consequences of technology. But what I would say in her defense is we've got the technology is happening around us. The reproductive technology is happening around us, and we need to, it's here, you know, she was right in terms of automation, you know, what she calls cybernation, what we call AI now, you know, new technologies around reproduction. It's happening and women are not in control of it. So how do we actually deal with this and make it work for us?
I want to point out that she wrote a whole chapter on feminism and ecology before there was even an ecofeminist movement. And she wrote about the concerns of ecology that are of direct interest to the feminist movement. And she said that there are direct, you know, overlaps in the ecological movement and the feminist movement. She wrote this chapter before the ecofeminist movement even existed. So again, I encourage the people that make that criticism to actually read her chapter 10, because she wrote before that movement even existed. And she said there was an overlap between the concerns of ecology and feminism. So read the book is all I can say.
I know she mentions ecology, but then she doesn't really develop that. And I think that was something I was slightly disappointed in, because she raised it. And then when I read it, it didn't really come back in terms of any kind of analysis.
I mean, it's a difficult
reaction to the book. I have lots of notes in the margin, but we didn't plan to discuss it. I thought she was predicting this whole movement of scientists to try to protect the earth. And she talks about the worship of fertility. And
maybe I need to reread it then. It's just because I can remember making my notes and writing, oh, ecology, and then not having the sort of, yeah, anyway, we all need to go back and read that some more and, and decide where we're going. Yeah.
As a feminist revolution could be the decisive factor in establishing a new ecological balance. Attention drawn to the population explosion, a shifting of emphasis from reproduction to contraception, and demands for the full development of artificial reproduction would provide an alternative to the oppressions of the biological family. In the cybernation, by changing man's relationship to work and wages, by transforming activity from work to play, activity done for its own sake would allow for a total redefinition of the economy, which would then redefine our relationship to ecology. If we weren't massively reproducing the population, we wouldn't be making such a demand on the ecology, is what she actually says. I don't know, maybe I have a blind spot because she impacted me so much in my youth. But what?
I think someone in the chat asked a question if there are any other feminist authors who have sort of taken her points, any of her points forward. Would you like? Yeah, there was a question in the chat. So, Batya, would you like?
Well, I think we're discovering now in the Millet group that Sexual Politics was actually published a little after, and her ideas were taken forward by Kate, like chivalry or discussion of chivalry, and it was like Shuli put up this big, you know, explosion, and then Kate got them down and, you know, developed them further.
I think her idea about not her opposition to concentrating everything into the genital sex and intercourse. I think that's an idea that, I mean, because as I said, it's a compelling idea. So I think probably I would like to be able to, you know, take it forward and research on that. I think it's something that I would personally like to work on. So yeah, that's something that I'm going to take away from the book with myself. Yeah.
Well, I think it's helped us understand transgenderism a lot better, because we can see it as a backlash. Use the dialectic method. We spoke about that at the beginning of our study group, Batya.
Yeah, we talked about how she talks about how when women get involved in somebody else's struggle, they're not aware of their own oppression, but they're fighting for other people's oppression. And we identified that that's what many women are doing with the transgender movement. They're fighting for others and not for themselves. And she was talking about that in terms of racial politics, but we applied that to transgender fighting now.
I think what she, if you read her second chapter where she's talking about women's history, and if you remember back when we did that, we talked about the suffragette movement, and there she says that it's a line that struck me the most. She said that sort of the fight for women's liberation became privatized. I mean, it was as postmodernism has sort of increased, and how things have become, how feminism has become more about do your own thing, and so it's individualistic. So the fight that is actually so systemic, it's so social, it's so political. It's been the scope has just completely been reduced. So I think that's also very. She was present when she said that, and I think that is something that we should be focusing on, especially with feminists sort of being forced to or pouring their energy into the gender identity movement, or sort of the backlash against any criticism of beauty and fashion and all these things. So I think that chapter is important. I would recommend you to read that chapter.
Yeah, she had a very clear way of writing about the privatization of sexuality, which really was very impactful in leading to understanding of pornography. Again, before it was a big movement. Okay, we have a couple minutes. Do you have a conclusion, Dorothea, for us?
Sorry, somebody asked for the email address in the chat, so I've just been trying to get that. So I'm just about to, it's all right, I've got it. I'm just about to paste it, but it means I've lost my.
Done.
All right, excellent.
Okay, good.
Not in the chat, sorry, in the Q&A. Sorry, see, that's what I mean. I've got my thread.
Yeah, I haven't been following. I keep peering down there, but
I just
want to say
that.
I want to say that there are many other women who aren't on the screen who also participated in these group discussions.
Yes.
And some of their ideas were reflected in what we had to say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Batya.
Yeah. So thank you to the two other women from my group that aren't here, because I've learned a lot from them.
I would encourage women to become part of these groups, because we over all this time, over these weeks of practicing, we developed this kind of friendship between us, and we shared, we laughed, and we expressed our frustrations and our anger. So it's that. So you should attend these study groups for the sake of building sisterhood. So thank you to everyone. Thank you, Batya.
Especially cross age and across class and across nations.
Yes.
Yeah, and you got some cooking recipes, didn't you, Batya?
Yeah. I'm a cook, so I started cooking, Welsh food and Yorkshire food recipes around the world. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. We were very honored that you wanted to have our webinar, and that you thought that it was worth it for us to share our discussion. So
thank you for
allowing
coming,
us this
yes,
time.
thank you.
Thank you.